Man, people really be thinking Lower Decks is out here like Red from that 70s show in that one episode of Star Trek Voyager where he's just erasing timelines and shit. Hello, interwebs. I hope you are all doing well. And today I want to talk about a controversy. And I put heavy air quotes on the word controversy here because it's very much a manufactured controversy surrounding the fact that Star Trek Lower Decks supposedly erased Star Trek Discovery from canonicity in the Star Trek franchise in its series finale. And this discourse is actually a few weeks old. At this point, I actually wanted to talk about it earlier, but I've been moving into a brand new place. I still wanted to talk about it despite it being a little older, because I think it's just goes to showcase how toxic fandoms think about franchises, think about storytelling, think about things like canon, and how small, honestly, a lot of their thinking is around these things. And this is just a perfect way to discuss that in this manufactured controversy that they're making. So I just want to discuss all of it because I think it's utterly fascinating as just an exemplar of all of these dynamics. But for those of you who haven't heard, just to give a quick brief overview, in the series finale of Star Trek Lower Decks, there's a galaxy-ending threat, because of course it's the end of a modern-era Star Trek show, so there has to be a galaxy-ending threat, where there is an anomaly that is placing one timeline with another universe's timeline. And in one of the first waves that we see a Klingon ship get hit with a wave, and the Klingons on the ship, who very much look like the Klingons from the Next Generation era, the sort of 80s, 90s Star Trek shows, get transformed into the look of the Klingons from Season 1 of Star Trek Discovery, where the Klingons had a very different aesthetic. It was an aesthetic that many fans across the spectrum had a lot of criticisms of, and was one that toxic fandoms particularly pointed to as like people saying they don't understand or don't get Star Trek. And so this moment is being used by them as evidence to say like, oh, Star Trek Lower Decks is saying that Star Trek Discovery took place in an entire other timeline. It's not canon with all the other Star Trek shows. And they're using it as a way to sort of generate a sort of manufactured narrative around this to sort of prove that like, oh, Star Trek Discovery is hated, it's tossed out of canon, and we've won. Because, for those of you who don't know, Star Trek Discovery, sort of the first iteration of this modern era of the Star Trek franchise, is very hated by the toxic fandom. For very obvious reasons. It's the type of show that they love to glom onto, because it's a show that has a lot of diversity in it. It has, a black woman at the lead, a lot of people of color within it, a lot of queer people within it, and so they obviously like to point in any of that, whenever there's not a straight white cis dude in the lead role as evidence of, like, wokeness or DEI, even though they'll say, like, we don't hate women, we don't hate queer people, we don't hate people of color, we hate the superficial, shallow representation, it's just forced diversity or whatever. But interesting how they always say that whenever it's anyone other than a cis white dude taking center space. But it's also a show that has, a lot of flaws. I particularly like Star Trek Discovery, but even I admit that it's a show that has, a lot of ups and downs, a lot of flaws, a lot of mistakes, as every Star Trek show does, but certainly some of them in Discovery are more indicative of this era of streaming TV, and sort of pronounced in a lot of ways. Like, again, the galaxy-ending threats all the time. So even I have criticism of it, but these toxic fandoms love shows like that where there's very overt flaws that people can point to, and they say, oh, these flaws, these problems are because of wokeness, DEI, because there's queer people in it, rather than the numerous different reasons that it could actually be. That it's, studio interference, or the writers didn't have enough time to write the show, or, the writers are, aren't up to snuff with other writers. Like, there's numerous reasons to sort of discuss the problems and flaws of a show. Maybe the showrunner has a particular, way of running things. Like, there's numerous things it could be. And also, it's called criticism, where we're supposed to discuss flaws not as like it's bad, but as a way to sort of discuss, like, oh, here's the ups and downs of a piece. Here's how it, works in terms of what it's trying to say and do, and here's where it doesn't, or at least here's what works for me and a personal preference, and here's what doesn't. But they just use it as sort of objective fact that this thing bad, this thing awful, and it's because of wokeness, DEI, whatever they want to point to at the time. And so Star Trek Discovery is kind of a perfect vehicle for them for that. And so this moment, and Mike McMahon, the showrunner of Star Trek Lower Decks, even pointed out that he was intentionally sort of poking the bear with this moment. They pointed this as evidence of like, hey, we've won. They admit that it's wrong. Like, look, we've won the day. It's sort of like a way to sort of like generate again, clicks and videos to sort of like claim a victory in some way, shape, or form, that they were objectively right and everyone hates Star Trek Discovery, and even Paramount wants to erase it from the timeline. Now, obviously, this is not the case. Star Trek Discovery is still considered canon by the franchise, by many people. It's still loved by many people. This is not evidence of that. You could even argue it within the show that, this isn't evidence of that, because we also see at different points in the episode the timelines getting overwritten, and things that also exist in the prime timeline of the series pop up, like the Klingon Barge of the Dead, which we know is also in the prime timeline. So it's like, what's to say that, like, the Klingon that we see get transformed into another Klingon, just that timeline also has this aesthetic? Like, there's no clear evidence that this is just saying Star Trek Discovery isn't canon within the universe, and it's not intended to be as such. It's Mike McMahon poking the bear a little bit on it, and also it being a Easter egg reference within the series towards Star Discovery. In fact, you can use it as saying it's a love letter to Discovery in a couple different ways. But all of that doesn't matter to me. What matters more to me is focusing on why they consider this moment to be a win for them. Because obviously, yes, they are generating, the people making these videos are using it to sort of generate outrage and just make a narrative for themselves. But why is it palpable? Why are they hyperfixating on this idea of canonicity? Few things before we get into that broader discussion. First and foremost, the look of the Klingons has always been a question within Star Trek. Like, the Klingons looked very different in Star Trek the original series, and they were changed for the movie Star Trek the Motion Picture because Gene Roddenberry wanted to make them look more alien-looking, because they now had the budget to do that. They had the budget now. They wanted them to look different. Like, that's all you needed. And then we get an explanation of why they look different in Star Trek Enterprise, the prequel series, that explains why their Klingons look different, when it didn't really need that. But if you wanted to have this canon moment of, like, explaining why they look that way, you can. Now you have it. There you go. It's here for you. And then Discovery is just another version of that. Like, it's an aesthetic change because it's a television show. It's not real. These folks talk about canon as if it's some hard truth that these new versions of Star Trek are betraying or breaking or violating or perverting in some way. A lot of these people will also point to something like Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek's vision for Star Trek. They do the same thing with George Lucas. Like, George Lucas had a vision for Star Wars that Kathleen Kennedy or the modern Star Wars shows Disney are ruining and perverting, as if there's some essential authority that is speaking to what these things are, instead of understanding that these are television shows created in the moment by different creators. And ultimately, when all these people are making arguments about canon or Gene's vision that we need to protect, what they kind of ultimately want is something small and contained, and to say, oh, this thing does not expand beyond these borders. And usually the borders, this confinement of what they see their thing as, are very shallow representations of it. Like, oh, we want a white dude in the lead. The registry number for a starship is this thing. Or, this piece didn't show up at this point in the canon timeline. Instead of enabling these stories to tell their own stories to the best effect that they want to tell. And if you want to change a piece of canon, change a piece of a story, honestly, in a universe, I think it's fine, because you should be desiring to tell the best story that you have. And that's not to say canon is irrelevant to writers. I'll talk about that more in a second. But it's more to say, what I prefer is a story that is fitting the themes of a work. When you work within Star Trek to me is a series about celebrating infinite diversity and infinite combinations, celebrating and showcasing a future where humanity has actively chosen, to pursue the best parts of ourselves, to stop worrying about acquiring money and acquiring things, and about pursuing our inner truth and pursuing that by learning about others, to see the infinite diversity and prism of what's out there in the universe so we can understand the infinite diversity within humanity itself and within ourselves. That's the core theme to Star Trek to me. And as long as a story is core to that, canon ultimately does not matter to me in terms of, like, facilitating that story. And that's not to say you should toss out canon, you should toss out the things that are there, but ultimately, if you need to smooth things over to fit the theme that you are telling, that's ultimately fine with me. And that's something, by the way, that Gene Roddenberry himself, the creator of Star Trek, agrees with. He, throughout his career in Star Trek, would always consider different elements of Star Trek canon. He created the original series, he worked on the animated series, and, he also helped create the Next Generation show. In all of those shows at different times in his life, he considered different elements of different Star Trek shows canon. The animated series wasn't considered canon for a very long time. Different elements from the original series are not even canon to each other. Like, you look at seasons 1 and 2 and 3 of Star Trek, the original series, and there are things that wildly change within the very own show that contradict each other. Like the size of the Federation. I think there's one point in the original series where the Federation is mentioned to be like half the galaxy. at one point. Whereas in The Next Generation as well, it's much more confined. If you look at maps of what the Federation is in that show, it's actually a very tiny portion of the entire galaxy. And that's because he was thinking about what the best story was at the time and the knowledge that he had at the time, and also the confines by which he was writing within. I'm actually, just to say it, I can't say exactly what it is yet, but I'm working on a project outside of YouTube that I can't fully announce. I'll announce in the future, but before it, I'm doing a lot of research. And I've been reading this really excellent book that's a sort of conversation that Gene Roddenberry had just before his death, a sort of narrative version of these recordings that this wonderful interviewer did with him, to sort of get a portrait of who he was. And one element that I found here is Gene Roddenberry talking about the production elements of Star Trek. And it's a really great quote that I want to read for you. And these are Gene Roddenberry's words, by the way. Star Trek and Star Trek The Next Generation are television shows. They're two different shows, but they are television shows. When I say Star Trek, I'm often not talking about the shows. I'm talking about my dream world, my philosophy, the one I wanted to put on television. And I did to a certain extent. I can't replicate my world on television because there are too many other considerations involved. It has to make money. It has to comply with current society standards of decency, today's values. It can never really fully explore the good side of a supposedly bad thing. And that's what I like to do most. We have to creep around an issue, say, like drugs. We have to condemn them because society condemns them. I'd like our people to go to a planet in which drugs were a way of life, not with all the violence and misery attendant on them now, not as a problem, but a natural part of evolution. A planet, say, where the rainforests have not been raped by the ignorant, and the chemicals found in the plants are an enhancement to human consciousness. Dude's talking about weed there. But ultimately, the point that he's getting at there is how he had an idea in his head. And there were all these other considerations that he had to take into account because it was on television, made in, the 80s, which had certain levels of decency standards. Same thing that Star Trek Discovery has today and other Star Trek shows. They are made within a corporate environment that dictates how these things are made. And even beyond that, whenever a writer creates something, they, and he even talks about this in here, is in any franchise, is something filtered through numerous writers. I mean, Gene Roddenberry himself often likes to venerate himself as like, I am Star Trek. But even he and many people want to point out like the show was made by many people, including the fans, who helped influence it in many ways too. People like DC Fontana, Gene Kuhn, the actors themselves, William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, etc. Like, and all the ones that have come after, all the way up to Sonequa Martin Green or Mike McMahon or whoever, Tawny Newsome. Like, they are all people that influence this thing and put their own spin and say on it, all hopefully towards the thematic goal. It's all going to have an influence on it. It's not just Gene's vision, it's a collaborative effort, and that's what art should be. A collaborative effort, a conversation between not just the artist, one single artist, if it's one artist, and the fans, but also all the people who work on it if it's a collaborative piece of art, which art generally, especially television, is. And so ultimately, when you look at these people demanding something fit canon, they're looking for some authority. They're looking for a limited view on this thing. They're looking for a voice of God from on high, be it Gene Roddenberry, George Lucas, whoever, to sort of say, this is the way it is, this is the Bible. And it's a limited ability to sort of reckon with the different meanings that art can have depending on the context of when it was made, the context of when we're watching it, the people who make it. And really the reason that they do that is they want it to be small. They want it to feel like it's this safe thing that they can point to as some objective truth, especially an objective truth that affirms them and their worldview of them being centered to the galaxy, especially toxic fans who are ultimately trying to uphold a white supremacist view in the world, because that's what toxic fandom really is. Like, it's white supremacy sort of being weaponized within fandom spaces. And it's trying to sell that to their audiences and say, like, this is the truth. This is the way the world is. This is the authority. This canon is the authority. This is the Bible. And these things, the queers, the people of color, the woke corporations are all ruining it for you. And they point to things that didn't actually exist, like Gene's vision. And Gene himself was very aware that, like, canon changed, his own ideas changed, the people who worked on a thing changed it, the fact that it was a television show made in a modern era for a corporation changed it, and the things that these people would defend is like, this is canon. You can't say that because in episode 5, Spock says blah, 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 blah. That ultimately, doesn't matter in the core scheme of telling a story. And again, I want to come back to this idea of canon as well, because at the end of the day, I'm not saying canon doesn't matter, but canon matters to the writers, the people making the thing. Because canon is a good thing in the sense that you can pull from it. You can make use of the context of the history that you are within to make your story stronger. Like using Spock and telling him in Strange New Worlds, like this era of Spock where we're at, like it's sort of a interesting piece within the long arc of who Spock is, and it's sort of telling a more emotional side of Spock's journey versus the more logical side of him versus the more balanced version of him we see in the movie era. And it sort of adds a different dimension to his character that I actually really like, that we're seeing a multi-layered version of his story. But also canon can be something that I think writers misuse. One of my big critiques of Strange New Worlds, for example, too, to keep on that show, is how they use the Gorn. The Gorn in the original series were a way to sort of say, like, hey, these people we consider monsters, they're also people too. And yes, there was some indigenous coding and things like that that made the Gorn a little bit problematic, but like it was a story about how we see these monstrous things and we otherize them, and yet they're also intelligent beings. And then we get to Strange New Worlds and they just get turned into like xenomorph monsters, who are repeatedly told, and maybe the show will develop this further, but in the episodes that it's had, like repeatedly told, they're just monsters that just kill and destroy things. It's not being aware of the context of what the original story was in. And as a result, I think lessens the Gorn. It's not fully pulling from the canon history that it's within. I think canon can bolster your meaning, can bolster what you're telling, and also I think it can work against what you're doing in the work, and I think some works are lessened by it. But then also, I'm someone who also believes that you tell your own story. But ultimately, I think it's a conversation, right? Like, what are you losing, what are you gaining when you change something in canon? What are you losing, what are you gaining that matters? Like, the Gorn thing, I think, to a degree, there's something to be said about the conversation that those two things are having with each other that I think lessens it. Like, those two contexts, that dialectic that they're put into, it lessens it. Whereas sometimes it's inconsequential. Who cares about a star date or when a character shows up? Who cares? Manipulate it for whenever you want to. And sometimes it bolsters it, like the Spock conversation. And so I think it matters to the writers. But us as fans, we don't have to follow that. We can make our own canon. People are yelling like, oh, they erased Star Trek Discovery from canon. And I just go, what does it matter? You can just say Star Trek Discovery isn't canon to you. Like, ultimately, at the end of the day, if you dislike Star Trek Discovery and you're like, it doesn't fit what I like about canon, it doesn't fit what I like about Star Trek, I think it's terrible trash, and I think it makes it lesser by having it in the same universe, cool. Then just say Star Trek Discovery, to you, is in a different timeline. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. If you want to say every single modern Star Trek show after Star Trek Discovery is set in a different timeline, that's fine. Me personally, like, I'm not a big fan of Star Trek Picard. I have a lot of issues with it. And actually, my favorite version of that era of Star Trek is in the novels. There's a great expanded universe novels series that takes place after the Next Generation and such that was written for years between the end of, like, Next Generation up until when Star Trek Picard came about that I loved and I thought was fantastic. That's the universe of Star Trek that I love the most. That's the one that I consider, like, my canon to a degree. In contrast to Star Trek Picard, which is a vastly different canon, even though that's the official canon based on what Paramount says. But for me, it's like, it doesn't matter. I like that version better.
I mean, as a writer, I also like just seeing how other writers have interpreted or grown canon in different ways over the years. Like, I go back to some of the original Gold Key Star Trek comic books that came out even around the same time the TV show did, the original series, and you'll see the Enterprise had rocket engines, not warp engines, which is just a different take on canon. I mean, there's like a whole run of Star Trek comics that take place after Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, that are completely incongruous with Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home. And there's numerous different versions of that at different parts of the Star Trek timeline that have all been erased or rewritten based on the canon that goes on in the TV shows because, you know, Paramount and the franchise dictate what's canon, but ultimately for us as fans or some of the writers that are writing some of the ancillary stuff, they don't have to follow that and they can just like sketch out inside or around the lines of canon. I find that fascinating to see how the different what ifs of how Star Trek could have been. In fact, wish we got more of that and didn't have to deal with copyright and canon and, you know, corporate dictates on that.
And if I ever worked for Star Trek, like my dream is, like I one day dream to work on Star Trek, I would have to work with Star Trek Picard as a franchise. And I think that's fine. I think that's be an interesting challenge as a writer with like, all right, I don't necessarily love all these things that Star Trek Picard did or said, but like, okay, as a writer, how do I incorporate that into what I want to say now, or with the story that I want to tell now? What do I change? What do I keep? What conversation do I want to have with what came before? I think that's an interesting challenge as a writer. But as like a fan, just watching the show, I can do whatever the hell I want, as can these people. But what these toxic folks want is an authority to say they are right. They want an institution to affirm them. They want an authority to affirm that they are correct. Because if an authority tells them they are correct, then that means they can shove everyone else down. They can prove themselves right and correct and virtuous, and they don't have to think about it. They don't have to wrestle with any of these questions. They don't have to wrestle with any interiority. They don't have to wrestle with their own thoughts and views. They can just point at an authority and say, oh yes, we're right. Paramount agrees with us. They hate Star Trek Discovery too. We're correct. But ultimately, it's a limited way to not only think about art and confining art, but also a limited way to engage with yourself. That you need some authority to prove you correct and right. And I'm not saying everyone who believes this thing, I'm not saying everyone who follows these toxic books are white supremacists, but it goes to that same mentality, right? That white supremacy works by making itself feel invisible, making itself feel like it's natural and normal. That makes it like these institutions reaffirm, systemic white supremacy, systemic homophobia, systemic transphobia, systemic sexism, patriarchy. All of these things normalize themselves and say this is the way the world is, and say that this is just how it goes, and they ingrain themselves in institutions. So when people push back against institutions, when people show that this is not actually the way the world is, people get angry because they're going against the naturalized, normalized way of things, and so they need an authority figure, the institutions, to come down and say, no, this is actually how it is. God said it was so. Donald Trump said it was so. George Lucas said it was so. Gene Roddenberry said it was so. They need some authority figure to affirm them and say, like, no, the way we feel about the world is correct, because if they ever question that, it would tear everything down. And that's, I think, one of the biggest things that we need to fight against. And this is not just white supremacists who feel this way. There's like a lot of institutional folks who are, supposedly more progressive, who still have this institutional thing in them. That is sort of like, oh, I'm scared if the world does not fit how I'm supposed to see it. And so anyone who challenges that, I get angry at and push down. And, this is just evidence of that. I'm sort of extrapolating out into a much larger political point that I didn't necessarily mean to get into. But that's why stuff like this fascinates me. Maybe what I might be writing about in a separate project that I'm not legally allowed to talk about yet. But yeah, it's just evidence of a larger question that I just am fascinated by when we talk about it within a Star Trek context. Anyways, I've rambled enough about this. I don't know if anyone's going to care or watch this, but I just wanted to talk about it. Anyways, hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.